One of the great gifts that my parents gave to me was a commitment to caring for one another. I watched them and I grew up helping out as they would mow lawns or pick up groceries or provide transportation or babysit or just otherwise provide a helping hand to both family and friends. This was especially the case as people faced sickness or grew close to death. It was an expression of generosity and love, and most of the time, at least, it was given without complaint. So it wasn't a surprise that within months of the day that I moved out of my childhood home to attend university, my old bedroom became my grandmother's hospice room. It was converted within a short time, and I would travel home on weekends to visit her and my family, playing guitar and sharing stories, often for hours, sitting on that bedroom floor with my grandmother, and then sleeping on the couch before heading back to class. After her death, that room then became a temporary residence of a series of other loved ones who needed a combination of care or supervision or just some extra help dealing with the ups and downs of life. My spouse had grown up with similar experiences, and we carried those values into our own family life together in various ways. And one expression of this was that I spent just over a decade homeschooling our child. It was an incredibly rewarding experience, and hopefully for him as well as for me, but it was also challenging. It was a kind of job that changed and even got more difficult every year, so that by the end, I was relearning trigonometry and solid-state chemistry in the evenings before teaching those lessons the next day. And there's nothing like dusting off 20 years of general knowledge each day to keep the brain sharp. So that was not the most challenging bit. I thoroughly enjoyed stretching my mind that way, especially when it came to designing our electives together. Now, the real challenge was navigating the social aspect of being a stay-at-home, homeschooling parent and caregiver. I was still working part-time in the community, and the three most common reactions I got when people were starting to get interested in my life and asking those inevitably invasive questions were these. One, why are you wasting your time doing that when you could be making such a bigger impact doing more important things? Two, can you help me with this project since you don't work and have the extra time? And three, your spouse doesn't mind that you're basically freeloading off her hard work. Many of the stereotypes about homeschooling, especially homeschooling in a state like Missouri that lacks almost any accountability, are well earned. Those assumptions and criticisms, they didn't surprise me, and they usually didn't even bother me. After all, I was and even remain critical about the lack of educational value provided by many homeschooling families. But what I hadn't expected was the general condescending attitudes about caregiving in general. Because of my parents' model of generosity, I'd grown up with a respect for unpaid caregiving and labor and the importance of informal and family caregiving, especially among us working class folks. But once I was exposed to those worst assumptions about caregiving, I began to see and understand how little we value care and caregivers in our society as a whole. The lack of support and respect for caregiving remains shocking to me, especially when we consider how vital it is to the well-being of ourselves and our families and our communities. In a 2017 report by the AARP, they estimated that 41 million family caregivers were donating 34 billion hours of unpaid labor every year, valued at $470 billion. That figure, $470 billion, was significantly higher than even out-of-pocket healthcare costs, which came in at around $366 billion in 2017. It was also higher than several other industries. For example, even if we combined the agriculture and the mining sectors in the United States, the value that year came in at $438 billion, $22 billion less than the value of unpaid caregiving. Yet, when you think about it, that number, $470 billion, is even more significant when you consider that it was determined using the average wage of underpaid caregivers, which was $13.81 an hour. The fact that caregiver wages are so low is another reflection of the low value we place on care. As the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, reminds us, all wages in the U.S. economy are politically and socially determined. But given that care work is heavily publicly financed, care wages are especially determined by political decisions via commission or omission. Practically speaking, what that point means is that we could more directly correct this problem. We could correct wage and labor standards for care workers using public policies if we wanted to do it. But we haven't done it. Instead, we have consistently and persistently undervalued caregiving, even though it's a huge component of our economy and it's vital to our social and personal well-being. Why do we keep doing that? Part of the answer is right there in the name. We care. Caregiving is vulnerable to this kind of exploitation because we're often motivated by family bonds, by love and compassion, by a sense of self-giving to provide that care regardless of the social and financial incentives or costs that are involved. And because many of us don't think about these issues until we have to do so, until it's upon us, then when we're already providing or receiving care, there's a sense of we just have to get through this. We can't add an extra layer on top of it, of trying to make change. Suddenly, the oxygen tanks need to be picked up, the insurance claims need to be filed, the myriad medical appointments that need to be scheduled and attended, and a whole host of other responsibilities all need to be addressed almost at once. And we somehow have to balance that with work and family and personal life. Is there really time to think about and advocate for the transformation of systemic roots that undervalue caregiving? But even when we do become advocates for change, that transformation is not as easy as you would think. And I say you'd think it would be pretty easy after all, because caregiving is one of those things that is truly nonpartisan. Most of us will provide at least some caregiving in our lives, and all of us lucky enough to live will experience illness and aging that requires help. But somehow, supporting caregivers and caregiving still hasn't been a priority. For example, last year in 2021, President Biden's budget included a tax credit of up to $5,000 to help with caregiving expenses. As the budget debate heated up, that credit was reduced to $2,000 and then finally cut entirely from the bill. Many social analysts have drawn a connection between these kinds of failures to our society's collective misogyny, xenophobia, and racism. Because historically, caregiving jobs such as the ever-present but also often socially invisible nannies, nurses, and maids were relegated to marginalized members of society, such as Black workers and women. Even today, over 90% of care workers are women, and disproportionately Black and Hispanic. As Lenore Paleodino and Rakeem Maboud pointed out, the undervaluation of caregiving labor and the people who perform it has persisted well into modern times. And the underlying sexism and racism that underpin such cultural norms, rooted in the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, have made it harder to develop a robust caregiving infrastructure over the decades. Indeed, even the major paid caregiving fields, such as child care, residential care, and home health care, are too often characterized by low wages for laborers and poor conditions for those receiving care. Too often, training is inadequate and career advancement is almost non-existent. As the EPI has reported, quote, "The development of the care sector and disparities within the care sector are fundamentally entwined with historical and current ableism, sexism, xenophobia, and racism. Globally and in the United States, care work has been devalued as women's work and is primarily performed by women who face discrimination across other identities, such as immigrant and or Black and Hispanic women. The devaluation of care work itself, along with the additional layers of discrimination many care workers face, in turn influence and perpetuate low wages and poor conditions in this industry," end quote. Those deep roots in the persistent ongoing injustices in our society may help hide and devalue the exploitation of care work and workers. However, like so many of our intractable social and economic issues, the pandemic has intensified and exposed, just taken the lid off of many of these problems. The number of unpaid caregivers approximately doubled during the pandemic. And an investor's guide from 2021 estimated that caregiving spending jumped to approximately $648 billion. That outpaces even pharmaceuticals. Further, a CDC study of more than 10,000 adults showed that caregivers were at higher risk for poor mental health outcomes than non-caregivers. This was especially true of those who were simultaneously responsible for both parenting children, caring for children, and adult caregiving. About 85% of them experienced adverse mental health symptoms related to their caregiving responsibilities, including 50% who reported suicidal ideation in the previous month. But the numbers for all caregivers were off the charts. About 70% of all caregivers reported adverse mental health symptoms, including anxiety and depression, 55%, or passive, 39%, or serious, 32%, suicidal ideation. For comparison, only 22% of non-caregivers reported anxiety and depression, and passive suicidal ideation was under 10%, and serious suicidal ideation was under 5% for non-caregivers. So this was an intensification of all the horrible things that we were experiencing during the pandemic. The pandemic study also exposed some of the underlying stressors. You can guess some of them. Family disagreements about caregiving and resentment about caregiving responsibilities tripled the risk of having adverse health effects. Feeling underprepared for caregiving responsibilities. And honestly, how can most of us ever feel prepared to step into that role? But feeling underprepared or feeling a loss of personal freedom, feeling increased financial pressures related to caregiving costs doubled those health risks. Those financial pressures included both lost wages and out-of-pocket expenses, which the AARP estimated at more than $7,000 per family for the year of 2021. The result was that caregiving cost about 26% of the average family that was providing that care. As always, those costs are more devastating for poorer families, as the average costs represent a higher percentage of their income. This brings us back to our earlier observations about racial disability and economic justice. Michelle Singletary reported that racial and economic disparities meant that average caregiving costs for Black families reached 34% of their total income, while Hispanic families spent approximately 47% of their income on that care. Given these and similar realities, it comes as no surprise that another 2021 study demonstrated that Black and Hispanic caregivers were at a higher risk of those adverse mental health outcomes, as were disabled caregivers, younger caregivers, and those balancing caregiving with working long hours, especially at some essential work. But the statistics don't capture the human feelings that go with those numbers. Those stories are often extremely private and personal, and I confess I'm not prone to put my own up on YouTube, especially when you think of the society we live in that cares so little for caregivers. So I'm going to share a story from Alexandra Drain, co-founder and CEO of Archangels, which is an organization dedicated to building a national movement that supports and honors caregivers. She shared a powerful glimpse into what the stats look and feel like for many people. In an interview, she said, "One night in the summer of 2020, I had passive suicidal thoughts. At the time, I had no idea that's what it was called. I just felt worn. I was in a very active caregiver situation and my caregiver intensity was high. I woke up one night at 3 a.m. and lay there reviewing all the ways I was failing as a caregiver, as a mama, as a partner, and at work. And I just felt tired. And I found myself thinking, if I got COVID-19 right now and went to sleep and never woke up, I'd be okay with that." Our most recent CDC study, she went on to say, pegs the rate of passive suicidal ideation for sandwich generation caregivers at 58%. One interpretation of that data and my middle of the night weary was just this: I was normal. And sometimes feeling normal about something that makes you feel really alone or even ashamed is a way to start feeling better. The first line of care is knowing you are not alone. That her story touches many of us so deeply that this feeling could be considered normal underscores just how deeply our society has failed and how urgently we need change. It is simply amazing that we've managed to devalue what is arguably the most essential aspect of a healthy society, offering and receiving care for one another. And we are left with that always looming question: what can we do? First, and especially for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about justice issues, we can become more aware of and explicit about connecting caregiving with the justice issues we already care about. For example, providing universal health care, what a wonderful thing, right? For everybody, but it would help caregivers both with financial limitations and having better access to resources they need. Basic progress in economic justice, such as paying living wages or having pension coverage or making unionization more easy to achieve. All of those things would make it possible, one, for people who otherwise lacked the skills or didn't want to be a caregiver to hire someone else to do that work, and two, for people who wanted to pursue a career in caregiving to be better financially able to do so. Most, if not all, of the positions that disability justice advocates have been working toward would also improve conditions for everyone needing care and their caregivers. And progress in racial justice would help address those underlying factors we discussed earlier. If you're engaged in any of those issues or other justice initiatives, you can pay attention to how caregiving is impacted and include that in your advocacy and actions. And if you're looking for specific policy analysis and recommendations, as usual, I like to recommend the Economic Policy Institute as a great starting point. At the personal and relational levels, the most immediate action we can all take is to help build support networks for caregivers. Studies by archangels concluded that feeling support from as little as one other person reduced the risk of depression by 40%. And anxiety by 30%. And having a sense of purpose was the best protection against those adverse mental health outcomes. Much of this kind of thing happens informally in our families and communities, but it's easy to take it for granted or to think it doesn't matter. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to write those cards and texts to check in, to make that phone call, to help clean house or to cook dinner, to run errands, to listen when a caregiver needs to talk, to take a walk, just to have 30 minutes outside the house. All of those things are so important. Please keep doing them. For more formally, support groups for caregivers are a good resource for many people, and those are available in person in many locations and now, of course, online, so that you can probably find the support that you need. And with the online support groups, you can even find the particular conditions that you might be working with, and it's a great opportunity. Respite care is another essential service, whether informally with a friend or formally with a program or voucher, to help long-term caregivers be able to sustain the care they're giving. Archangels also maintains a resource page that's searchable by state to help you connect with those extra things that you need. All of these things, too, will help us in the essential work of transforming our broader culture. A basic reflection that we can use throughout the day to help us be more aware of and committed to this transformation is simply, what might a society look like that reorients itself around supporting and valuing the giving and receiving of care? And you can bring that question into the things you already do. Can I do this in a caring way? Can I recognize the care that others are giving? Can I have appreciation for that care? because all of us require care every single day. Even when we can provide much of the care ourselves, when we're lucky enough to do that, we rely on our entire society to help provide the resources that we need to enjoy life. We need to normalize that support and accessibility for everyone, regardless of their medical and social needs. There is no reason why we can't build the infrastructure we need to support this basic social function. No one should ever be left to feel like a burden, and no one should ever need to feel burdened by the giving and receiving of care. If we care about our future, we will care about caregiving and reshape our society to reflect those values. Whatever action you can take, let's work together to make this long overdue transformation something real.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.